I take great pleasure in introducing Professor Karen Ni Mheallaigh, who was a scholar at Trinity College Dublin, lecturer at Swansea, and then now at Exeter, but she is newly promoted to professor, which gives me great pleasure, having known her for quite a long time. She held a Marie Curie Research Fellowship at the Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies in Denmark in 2014 to 16, when she was working on a project on discovering the ancient scientific imagination. And she's now going to talk to us about novel entertainments from pantomime to the moon.
Well, great. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Judith. I feel like Ewan is my kind of academic granddad, and via Judith is kind of my academic mum, if that isn't terrible. But yeah, it's a really great pleasure to be here. I was going to start by apologising for my PowerPoint. If my students were here, they'd be aghast. I never, ever use PowerPoint. So this will all be very cartoon-like. But I'm not going to apologise for it because I had such fun putting it together. I discovered a world of colour, I discovered transitions, and hours of displacement activity ensued. So if nothing else, this is a kind of meta exercise in what happens to somebody who never works on the visual when they're unleashed on PowerPoint. Okay, so what I wanted to do this evening was just to I've got quite a modest goal. I wanted to evoke something of the rich entertainment culture of the Greek cities in the Roman East, under the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. As we've already seen, these cities were marked by a vibrant theatrical and visual and literary culture. And they may well have been the hotbed for a new wave or new waves of exciting prose literature in the Roman Empire, as we shall see. And what I want to focus on is two forms of entertainment in particular, pantomime, the first, and then moving over to novelistic literature. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay, right, well, I've got a few maps here just to orientate us. I wasn't able to find any particularly good maps, but anyway, just some of the main cities, Smyrna, Colophon, Ephesus, Priene will come up, Miletus. There are other few cities off the slide, as it were, that I'll come back to. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about, so we've just had the Ionian seaboard, more or less here. But I'm also going to be interested in this area here, Antioch on the Orontes, which is a really important site for the history of pantomime. And my favourite author, who comes from somewhere around here, a place called Samosata, Lucian of Samosata, who was himself very interested in pantomime. So these are the kind of both areas that I'll be focusing on. I didn't lie. Okay. So first of all, what is pantomime? Well, it's an extremely fraught question. But we are in the happy position of having some essays on the topic from antiquity. And probably the most important source is this one, Lucian, an essay on the dance, which was probably produced around the year 165 AD, and quite possibly in the city of Antioch itself. Lucian seems to have been part of the retinue of the Emperor Lucius Verus. And Lucius Verus spent some of the early 160s in Antioch when he was busy with affairs in Parthia. And we know that Lucius Verus was an ardent fan of theatre and pantomime. And so Lucian may well have written this essay praising the art of pantomime as a way to curry favour with Lucius Verus. But in Antioch itself, a city which seems to have had a lively culture of theatre and pantomime and performances of different sorts, novels as well. And Lucian defines pantomime as the demonstration, deixein, through movements of the things that are being sung, ta I domina. So there's a strong kinetic element and a strong visual element, but also words play a part in this as well, and music. So it's really a multimedial kind of entertainment experience. Fabula saltata in Latin, and in the epigraphic record, it's in Greek, it's referred to, we get references to hypocritai, to actors of the tragike en rhythmos, or en rhythmos kinesis, of kind of tragic rhythmical movement, and that's how it tends to be referred to. Some of these guys, some of the very skilled pantomime performers make it into the epigraphic record. So we have this guy Plutogenes, an inscription from Priene around 80 BC, tells us that he was hired to perform for 3 days in the city there. We have from Pompeii, so moving back to the Italian sphere, a magistrate, Aulus Clodius Flaccus, was so proud of the setups that he put up for the games in honour of Apollo, and that he had inscribed on his funeral monument the fact that he had, how many boxers he had funded and how many gladiatorial games. But he also emphasises that he got all the pantomimes, including one called Pylades. Now, Pylades seems to be a kind of a nom de plume that many pantomime performers adopt, but this guy is very proud of having sponsored these pantomime performances in Pompeii. And this guy at the bottom, the citizens of Delphi in the 3rd century AD erected a statue to him, and we have the statue base on which there is an inscription recording his extraordinary career, Tiberius Iulius Apolaustus. We're told that he's a superstar. He travels all over the Mediterranean world, both the Greek world and the Hellenized East, winning victories in festival competitions in Pergamum. If I press up, I go back. Is that right? Oh, sorry, you have to go back through my reversed. Yeah. So we're told, for example, this guy was hurtling all over the world. Pergamum, which is a little bit further north. Magnesia on the Menander, somewhere kind of here. Tralles, a little bit further inland. Miletus, Ephesus. Smyrna, Sardis a little bit further inland, and many, many other places. This guy toured all over and was rewarded everywhere he went with cash, prizes and honorary citizenships and priesthoods and honorific statues and inscriptions. So a real superstar. Okay, let's see if I can... Okay. We hear of festivals in the late 2nd century. It seems that competition at festivals opened up for pantomime artists. So they're kind of a relatively latecomer on the entertainment scene, entering into the game, competing with the kind of performers that Ewan was talking about, with the performers of prose and comia and hymns and kitharody and aulody musicians and tragedy, etc. Okay, so what sort of themes then did pantomime deal with? Well, Plutarch tells us that there were essentially two main strands of pantomime. The slightly higher brow one involved plots from classical tragedy, and a slightly simpler form which seems to have been more pastoral in mood and involved a kind of a dance involving pans and echo and satyrs and maybe an eros. We have sources that suggest that episodes from the Aeneid were danced, were performed. For example, the Dido sequence seems to have seeped into the pantomime milieu. We have, Edith Hall has, I think, been the most recent one who's argued that we have a possible pantomime libretto, a late papyrus, the so-called Barcelona papyrus, which depicts the scene of Alcestis' death. So a great, highly emotive scene. So what seems to be, the impression I think we get is a predilection for highly emotive scenes, lending themselves presumably to extravagant gesture and interpretation in dance, but also high points of mythology, very well-known stories, presumably so that the audience could sort of sit back and not be worried too much about trying to follow what story is being told, but would recognise the story and could therefore just sit back and appreciate the skill with which the dancer is interpreting the story. That seems to be the idea. Why have I got this slide up here? Well, Ewan, to return to Apuleius, in Apuleius' novel Metamorphoses in Book 10 contains a lavish description of a pantomime which took place, he tells us, in the theatre at Corinth, and which was depicting this scene here, the judgment of Paris, the famous occasion which essentially led to the Trojan War, ultimately. And Apuleius describes the goddesses being gathered on a kind of an artificial mountain that was constructed in the theatre, and that Paris was there, the actor Paris, and they had real live sheep as well, and all little boys and girls dancing the roles of erotes, and it really sounds quite elaborate. That's probably, Regina Mai has argued that it's probably quite an unusual performance. Usually we think pantomime involved basically a solo performer, a male performer usually, who would dance, wearing a mask with a closed mouth, because this is nothing to do with speech. He is not communicating through words, he's communicating through gesture. And he would dance to the accompaniment of musicians, but also either a solo singer or a chorus, if it's a grander style of performance, who would sing the libretto. So there is a story being sung, but the focus is on the dancer and his body and how he interprets the story that's being sung. Now, this kind of scenario, and the scenario that Apuleius describes, is something much grander and probably something quite unusual. But yeah, I think one of the interesting things for me there is the mixture of, well, we have obviously a high degree of technology in building this artificial mountain, but the mixture of the real and the artificial as well, with the real sheep interacting with the actors, that's something we'll come back to. This is a mosaic that comes from Antioch. Was this maybe, it's evoking the scene from mythology? Was it referring to perhaps some kind of performance of the mythological tale? Well, we don't know. But the one thing that is very interesting about pantomime is that the form of it is, because for its bare minimum, it just requires a solo dancer and a solo singer. And it's extraordinarily flexible in form. So you could start with that. You could scale up to having a chorus singing the libretto and many extras interacting with the dancer, something much more grand. But you could just have one dancer solo and one singer. In other words, this is a form that can be adapted to all different sorts of settings. And we have sources that suggest that wealthy patrons would have pantomime performances in their homes, in the dining room after dinner, for example. We hear of some of the emperors enjoying that. But also Dio Chrysostom tells us about pantomimes and pantomime teachers teaching classes on the street while vendors are going by. And of course in the great theatres, many examples of which we have seen. This is a little bit redundant now. Ewan also showed the theatre of Ephesus, but we can imagine one of these settings, kind of aerial view and a view of what you would have been facing. And we can imagine that this might have been the sort of thing that the pantomime would have been facing. In his performance. Antioch, we've seen the mosaic there. Antioch, very important for the history of pantomime, not only because of Lucian, who may well have written his essay on the dance there, but also because of Libanius, a later figure in the 4th century who was resident at Antioch, and who himself also wrote a vigorous defence of the art form. Probably written in, we know in his case it's written in response to an earlier excoriation by Aelius Aristides, who slammed pantomime, the art form. And Libanius and Lucian both defending it, both at Antioch. So Antioch is a really key place for this art. Okay, so what was the experience like then? Well, apart from the obvious visual element, sources really emphasise the aural. It must have been actually something quite cacophonous. We get references to all sorts of instruments being used, wind instruments. We've got a tuba, we've got various horns. This is just taken from a mosaic from Leptis Magna, which just illustrates these instruments. What you have in the centre here is this hydraulis, the water organ. So again, I'm kind of interested in this use of technology alongside this art form. A nice woman with a Flavian hairstyle playing the water organ there. And this instrument seems to have been used in pantomime, particularly in contexts, maybe we could imagine open air contexts, where you really need loud decibels to, swell the soundscape. This made a lot of noise. Sources are kind of interested in it because it's an instrument you can see, it's different from the others. It's a complex instrument, many pipes and parts. Not only all of this kind of sound going on, but the other thing that's continually remarked on as part of the soundscape is the clacker. That was meant to indicate sound. So you've got this this scabellum, this instrument, which is kind of a foot thing, a clacker, worked into a sandal. And this is the scabellarius would wear this, and he'd be the timekeeper of the music. We can see it in action here in a fresco from Pompeii, but apparently it made really quite a racket. So you've got a lot of different sounds going on. What I find really interesting is also the appeal to the olfactory senses. So we hear from late sources of pantomime dancers burning perfumes as part of the performance. And indeed, if people remember the 10th book in Apuleius' Metamorphoses, the kind of the coup de grace at the end is the artificial mountain spews a kind of saffron juice, a kind of a perfume, which then fills the performing space with its sweet odour. And Edith Hall has made a very interesting argument with the Barcelona papyrus, which might have been a libretto, that one that I mentioned, describing the death of Alcestis. At one point in that text, Alcestis is arranging her funeral bier, and she gathers all kinds of foliage and spices and unguents, and there's a command to burn all of the unguents. And Edith Hall has suggested quite nicely, I think, that that might have been an embedded cue to the performers to burn the spices or the unguents at the time. In which case I find that really interesting, because what we have there is a diegetic scent. And we're quite used in film studies, for example, to think in terms of diegetic music, when the music that you're listening to in the soundtrack is actually part of the story world of the film. But here with this, I think we've got something like diegetic scent, where the actual scent the audience would have been smelling is part of the fiction that they're watching, the story world of Alcestis burning her funeral spices. So in this way, a pantomime is using the senses to break down boundaries between the story world and the world of the audience. Pantomime seems to be all about the breaking down of boundaries in lots of different ways. It seems to mediate between high culture and low in quite controversial ways. The dancer himself, I've already said, like the hydraulis, the water organ, he's one body but many personae. And he's compared frequently to the shapeshifter god Proteus because of that. But also the breaking down of any boundaries between the world, the illusory world of the story, and the audience. Sources emphasize the absolute immersion of the audience in the fiction, and that could be quite problematic. For example, we hear of audience members watching quite a sexy pantomime and then, running home to enjoy their wives. It was quite felt to sort of really stimulate the senses, and perhaps there's something about the immediacy of the visual and the kinetic in that. We also hear sources describing the audience swaying, their movements kind of mirroring what's going on in the actor. So there's that kind of dangerous seepage between what the actor is doing and what the audience then does in response. Well, to move on quickly to, we're not going to deal with him, nor that, but to move on to novels. Well, this part of the Greek world has a very rich and ancient history in prose, stretching right back to the 6th century BC. Our earliest Milesian thinkers, Anaximander, Heraclitus, books being associated with them, and of course then Herodotus and Hecataeus. The Milesian tales then a good bit later, these kind of slightly naughty or risque adultery tales in prose. And last but not least, the novels, the Greek novels. This is the opening line taken from Caratone's novel, Kyrios and Callirrhoe, where you can see that he proudly announces himself as a citizen of Aphrodisias. Clerk, so this is another industrious administrator to follow Ewan's secretary. This guy is the clerk, where are we? He's the Hypographius to the Rhetor of Athenagoras. Stefan Tilg has argued that this might have been the first novel. I'm not quite sure I follow that, but it is clear that it's one of the earliest ones, and if so, that puts Aphrodisias, in the limelight really for the cradle of this, or one of the cradles of this new genre. And it's not the only one that seems to have had an impact on this city. Other early novels also seem to have infiltrated the cultural imagination of the world of the Greek East, particularly so Aphrodisias here, but also Antioch, as we're going to see. Two novels that I'll mention, the Metaicus and Parthenope, a fragmentary novel, and the Ninus romance. Both of those have plots that are set in this part of the world. And both of them, we only have the fragmentary remains of the novels, but we know that the novels, they had this remarkably protean diffusion into the local visual culture. In two strands, Lucian suggests to us that the Metaicus and Parthenope story, for example, Polycrates' daughter, was part of the pantomime tradition. It was a part of that story was danced. And also, well, again, the Ninus story and Metaicus again. So we have evidence to suggest that the novels seeped into the pantomime tradition. Also, the visual culture, these beautiful mosaics from Antioch. So there we have Parthenope and Metaicus depicted. And again, the same too, Metaicus and Parthenope sitting close together, also from Antioch. and Ninus, in this case, Ninus on a kind of a bed, gazing at a picture of a woman and a woman offering him a cup there. These have been interpreted as possibly visualizations of scenes from these lost novels. Are they scenes of pantomime? Are they scenes of novels? Well, one of the interesting things is that there are no scanographic markers in these mosaics. None of the characters is wearing masks. So this makes more likely that it is actually a visual reception of the novels themselves. Okay, and finally to the moon, two authors, Antonius Diogenes, quite possibly from Aphrodisias, mid-1st century, possibly a little bit later, and Lucian, whom we've already met quite a lot, from Samosata. Both of them, I don't have time to go into the details, but both writers of probably the most experimental prose fiction in antiquity. And both of them take their characters to the edges of the known world, interestingly far to the west. It's like we've got fantasies of the far western frontier here in the eastern cities, and up to the moon. Lucian, in these two works, the Icaramenopus and True Stories, takes his characters to the moon, from where they actually pause and turn their gaze backwards and look at the earth. So I suppose the final idea I wanted to leave you with was, we are now just about 49 years after the first became a reality. Man actually walked on the moon. But that tradition goes right back to these guys in these Greek cities where they first imagined people going to the moon and actually populated the moon. And Lucian, with his Selenoscopiae, for the first time in the European tradition, imagined this, what it was be like to look at our world from another planet, from the Earth. And this connects it with this. This has been hailed as the most famous photograph in human history, the Blue Marble, taken on December 7th, 1972 by the crew of Apollo 17. But I leave that there just to remind you of the vivid link between modern scientific endeavour and exploration and the cultural imagination of the Greek East, where entertainment was literally out of this world.